The road stretched endlessly under the golden hues of the setting sun, a quiet countryside path where the only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was supposed to be just another peaceful evening, but fate had something extraordinary in store. A dusty old pickup truck rumbled along the deserted road, its driver, an elderly farmer named Henry, gripping the wheel with a familiar ease. He had been tending to his fields all day and was finally heading home, eager to rest his weary bones. But as he rounded a bend, his eyes caught something unusual up ahead. His heart clenched. Lying in the middle of the road was a horse, an exhausted, wounded mare, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Henry slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the pavement. Without hesitation, he flung open his door and rushed toward the fallen creature. As he got closer, he saw the mare's glossy coat was streaked with sweat and dirt, her legs trembling as if she had been running for miles. But there was something else, something that sent a jolt of urgency through his chest. The mare was in labor. Henry's calloused hands trembled as he crouched beside her, his mind racing. He had delivered calves before, even helped with lambs and goats on his farm, but never a horse. And certainly not under circumstances like this. She had clearly been struggling for a long time, her body weak, her spirit on the edge of surrender. The sight tore at him. As he assessed the situation, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle made his heart pound. He turned his head to see headlights cutting through the dimming light, a car speeding toward them. Panic surged. He jumped to his feet, waving his arms frantically, hoping the driver would see them in time. The tires screeched as the vehicle skidded to a stop just inches away. A young woman leapt from the driver's seat, her face pale with shock. "Oh my God," she whispered, rushing forward. "What happened?" "I don't know," Henry replied, his voice thick with concern. "She just collapsed here, but she's having a baby." The woman, who introduced herself as Emily, knelt beside the horse, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm a vet," she said quickly, brushing her dark hair away from her face. "We have to help her." Relief washed over Henry. If anyone could give this mare a fighting chance, it was Emily. But as she examined the horse, her expression darkened. "She's in bad shape," she murmured. "She might not make it through this." The words hung heavy in the air, an unspoken sadness settling between them. But neither of them was willing to give up. Henry fetched his jacket and carefully placed it under the mare's head, whispering soothing words as Emily worked with practiced precision. The birth was difficult, each moment stretching unbearably long. The mare groaned, her strength fading, but Emily and Henry refused to let her struggle alone. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny foal entered the world. A collective breath was held as Emily quickly wiped the newborn clean, her hands moving with both urgency and care. The foal's small body was still too still. Henry felt his heart squeeze. "No, not like this. Not after everything." Emily gently rubbed the foal's chest, urging it to breathe, her own breath caught in her throat. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, a soft, weak whinny. The foal twitched, then gasped, its tiny nostrils flaring. Life flickered in its eyes. Henry let out a choked laugh, and Emily sighed in relief, brushing away the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. But their celebration was short-lived. The mare had stopped moving. Emily's face paled. "No, no, no," she whispered, placing her hands on the horse's side. She could feel the slow, fading heartbeat beneath her palm. The mare had given everything for her baby, and now she was slipping away. Henry clenched his fists. This wasn't fair. He had seen life and death more times than he could count, but this was different. And then, just as they thought all hope was lost, something happened that neither of them could explain. The mare, with what seemed like her final breath, lifted her head ever so slightly. Her eyes, filled with something beyond exhaustion, locked onto her newborn. It was as if, in that moment, sheer will kept her going. Emily gasped. "She's fighting. But would it be enough?" The battle for life had only just begun. Henry and Emily held their breath, watching the mare struggle to stay conscious. Her body trembled, her breath shallow and uneven. She had given everything to bring her baby into the world, but now it seemed like she had nothing left to give. Emily placed a gentle hand on the mare's neck, feeling the weak, fading pulse beneath her fingertips. "She needs help. Fast," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Henry nodded, his mind racing. "I have a barn not far from here," he said quickly. "We can take her there, try to get her stable." Emily glanced at the foal, who was wobbly on its thin legs, nudging at its mother with tiny, desperate whimpers. If they didn't act fast, the foal would lose its mother forever. Henry hurried to his truck, yanking open the back as fast as his tired hands would allow. Emily worked quickly, using her coat as a makeshift sling to support the foal, while Henry gently draped a blanket over the mare. But lifting her was another challenge. She was weak, barely holding on, and every movement sent a shudder through her frail body. "Come on, girl," Henry whispered, his voice soft but pleading. "Just a little longer." The mare let out a weak, exhausted breath, as if she understood. With one final push of effort, they managed to get her onto the truck bed. Emily cradled the foal in her lap as Henry drove, the tires kicking up dust as they sped down the road. The ride felt endless. Every second, Emily checked the mare's breathing, her fingers brushing against the fragile rise and fall of her chest. The foal nestled against her, its tiny heart beating fast. It didn't understand what was happening. It only knew one thing. It needed its mother. Finally, the barn came into view. Henry pulled up, barely stopping before jumping out and opening the truck bed. He didn't wait for instructions. He just acted, years of farming instincts kicking in. He grabbed a pile of hay, spreading it thickly on the barn floor, creating a soft space for the mare to rest. Together, they carefully lifted her down, placing her onto the straw. The mare let out a faint groan, her body sinking into the warmth beneath her. The foal stumbled forward on unsteady legs, pressing its small face against her side. Emily worked quickly, grabbing a flashlight from her bag and checking the mare's eyes. They were dull, unfocused. She was still with them, but barely. "She's dehydrated," Emily murmured, reaching for her emergency kit. "Malnourished, exhausted. She's been running for a long time." Henry frowned. "Running from what?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know." She gently touched the mare's side, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs beneath her thin coat. But whatever it was, it almost killed her. Henry's jaw tightened. He had seen plenty of strays before, but this mare was different. Someone had owned her once. He could tell by the faint indentations on her coat, likely from a saddle that had been strapped to her for too long. She had been used, pushed past her limits. And now, she had collapsed in the middle of nowhere, fighting to bring a new life into the world. "She needs fluids," Emily continued, pulling out a small bag. "And food. But the real question is, where did she come from?" Henry glanced at the foal, who let out a small, weak cry, pressing its tiny nose into its mother's side. A deep sense of protectiveness filled him. This wasn't just a case of a lost animal. Something had happened to this mare before she reached that road. Something bad. As Emily set up the four, Henry stood and grabbed his phone. He didn't know what kind of trouble this horse had been through, but he was going to find out. He dialed the number for the local animal shelter, explaining the situation as quickly as he could. The woman on the other end listened carefully before pausing. "You said she looked underweight? And she was running before she collapsed?" "That's right," Henry confirmed. There was another pause. Then the woman sighed. "We've had a few reports lately. Horses disappearing from nearby farms. Some of them turn up miles away, abandoned. Some don't turn up at all." Henry's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you saying someone did this to her on purpose?" "We don't know yet," the woman admitted. "But if she was running that hard, she was probably escaping from something." Henry's stomach twisted. He looked back at the mare, who let out another weak breath, her body still trembling. She hadn't just been lost, she had been fleeing. Emily must have sensed the shift in his mood, because she looked up. "What is it?" Henry lowered the phone. "She might have been stolen." Emily's eyes widened. "Stolen? The shelter says they've had reports of missing horses," he explained. "Some just vanish. Others get dumped in bad shape, like this one. Emily frowned, looking back at the mare. It made sense. The exhaustion, the wounds, the desperate run, until she physically couldn't go any further. She had been running for her life. The foal let out another soft cry, pressing itself against its mother's side. The mare barely reacted, her energy nearly gone. Emily quickly reached for another blanket, draping it over her. "She needs rest," Emily said softly. "A lot of it." Henry nodded, his mind still racing. Someone had done this to her. Someone had pushed her to the brink, not caring if she lived or died. And whoever they were still out there. As the wind howled outside, Henry looked down at the fragile new life in the barn, the tiny foal who had entered the world under the most impossible circumstances. The mare had risked everything to bring it into the world, had fought with every ounce of strength she had left. But was that strength enough to keep her alive? The question hung heavy in the air. Outside, the night deepened, the wind whispering through the trees. And somewhere, beyond the safety of the barn, the danger that had driven the mare to the edge of her life was still lurking, waiting. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The mare lay still, her breathing shallow, while the tiny foal curled against her side, too young to understand how fragile the moment was. Henry and Emily sat in silence, listening to the quiet sounds of the barn, the soft rustling of hay, the occasional whinny from the other horses in their stalls, the wind pressing against the wooden walls. Henry had seen plenty of hardship in his life, but something about this situation made his gut twist. He looked at the mare, at the faint scars running along her body, the sharpness of her bones beneath her thin coat. Someone had used her, pushed her beyond her limits, and then left her to fend for herself. But why? And where had she come from? Emily stayed close, checking the fore-drip, adjusting the blankets, whispering words of comfort to the mare, even though she wasn't sure if the horse could hear her. "She wants to live," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. She wouldn't have made it this far if she didn't. Henry nodded, watching the foal nuzzle its mother, instinctively searching for warmth and comfort. "And what if she doesn't make it?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "What happens to the baby?" Emily hesitated before answering. "Foals need their mothers," she said carefully. "But if it comes to that, we'll figure something out." Henry exhaled slowly. He had raised animals his whole life, but this was different. There was something personal about this one, something unfinished. He wasn't the type to get tangled up in things that didn't concern him, but this felt bigger than just a lost horse. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. When he pulled it out, the shelter's number flashed on the screen. "I made a few calls," the woman on the other end said. "No one's reported a horse matching her description missing, but..." She hesitated. "But what?" "There was an auction about a week ago. A bad one." Henry frowned. "What do you mean bad?" "Illegal," she clarified. "A group was caught transporting horses without proper documentation. Authorities managed to stop some of the trucks, but others got away. No one knows where those animals ended up." Henry's stomach tightened. "You think she was one of them?" "It's possible," the woman said. "If she escaped, she could have been running for days." Henry glanced at the mare again, thinking about the way she had collapsed in the middle of the road. How desperate she must have been. Who's behind all this? "That's the problem," the woman admitted. "These groups don't leave paper trails. The people involved disappear just as fast as the animals do." Henry's jaw clenched. He had heard stories about illegal auctions before. Horses being shuffled from one place to another like they were nothing but cargo. But knowing this mare had been part of something like that made his blood run cold. Emily must have noticed his change in expression. "What is it?" Henry ended the call and turned to her. "She might have been part of an illegal auction." Emily's eyes widened. "You think she escaped?" "Could be." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Whoever had her wasn't planning on taking care of her. That's for sure." Emily looked back at the mare, her heart sinking. The signs were all there. The malnourishment, the exhaustion, the way she had pushed herself past her breaking point just to survive. It made her sick to think about what could have happened to her if she hadn't gotten away. The foal let out a small sound, shifting closer to its mother, unaware of the darkness that had nearly swallowed them both. We can't let them take her back, Emily said suddenly, her voice firm. Henry looked at her. We don't even know who they are. Exactly, she said. And until we do, she stays here. Henry didn't argue. He knew she was right. Whoever had done this wasn't going to come looking for the mare because they cared about her. If anything, they'd only want her back to sell her again, to squeeze whatever profit they could from her before tossing her aside. And that wasn't going to happen. Not on his watch. The hours dragged on, and the storm outside picked up, the wind howling against the barn. Henry grabbed an old blanket and draped it over Emily's shoulders, realizing for the first time how late it had gotten. You should get some rest, he said. Emily shook her head. I'm fine. Henry sighed, leaning against a wooden beam, his eyes still on the mare. She's lucky you were there tonight. Emily glanced at him. So is the foal. Henry didn't say anything, but he knew she was right. If he had driven by a few minutes later, if he hadn't seen the mare in time, if Emily hadn't been there to help, none of them would be here right now. Fate had brought them to that road for a reason. And deep down, Henry knew this wasn't over yet. Somewhere out there, someone knew what had happened to this horse. Someone knew where she had come from, and someone might be looking for her. The night stretched on, but neither Henry nor Emily could bring themselves to leave the barn. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken understanding between them that something wasn't right. The mare's breathing had steadied, but she was still weak, her body unmoving except for the occasional flicker of her ears. The foal, now more aware of its surroundings, kept nudging against her, letting out small, uncertain sounds, as if it could sense the danger still lingering in the air. Henry sat on a wooden crate, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing with questions. He had been around horses his whole life, but this wasn't just a case of a lost or abandoned animal. This mare had been running from something or someone, and if she had escaped from an illegal auction, that meant whoever had owned her before wasn't just going to forget about her. Emily kept checking on the four, making sure the mare was hydrated, adjusting the blankets to keep her warm. Every so often, she glanced toward the barn doors as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment. The uneasy feeling in her chest refused to go away. Henry finally stood, unable to sit still any longer. He walked to the barn doors and pushed one open just enough to look outside. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily quiet. His truck sat where he had left it, parked just beyond the fence. The road stretched into the darkness, empty. But something about the silence unsettled him. Then he saw them, headlights in the distance. At first, it was just a faint glow, barely noticeable. But as the seconds passed, the lights grew brighter, moving fast. The hair on the back of Henry's neck stood up. He had lived on this land for years, and at this hour, no one had any reason to be driving down this road. He turned back toward Emily. Someone's coming. Her head snapped up. Are you sure? Henry didn't answer. He quickly grabbed the lantern hanging from a hook and dimmed it, casting the barn into partial darkness. Emily moved instinctively, pulling the blanket higher over the mare, as if shielding her would make her invisible. The sound of an engine echoed in the still night air, growing louder by the second. Henry stepped outside, his hand resting on the old rifle mounted just inside the barn door. Not because he planned to use it, but because something told him whoever was coming wasn't here for a friendly visit. The vehicle slowed as it neared his property, its headlights sweeping across the fence line. Then it stopped. The engine idled, humming low, its presence unnatural in the stillness of the countryside. Emily appeared beside Henry, her voice barely above a whisper. Who is that? Henry didn't take his eyes off the truck. I don't know. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. The man was tall, his frame bulky beneath a heavy jacket. He took a slow look around, then started walking toward the barn. Henry's pulse quickened. Stay here, he muttered to Emily before stepping forward, meeting the man halfway. Can I help you? The man stopped a few feet away, his face obscured by the shadows. You own this place? His voice was deep, rough. Henry nodded. Yeah. What's it to you? The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. I'm looking for something. Henry didn't flinch. That's so. The man took another step forward, just enough for the faint moonlight to catch the edge of a scar running down the side of his cheek. "Yeah," he said slowly. "A horse." Henry's fingers curled slightly at his sides, but he kept his face unreadable. "I don't know anything about that." The man let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That's funny. See, I heard different." Henry's jaw tightened. The only way this man could know the mare was here was if someone had tipped him off, or if he had been looking for her all along. Emily was still inside, likely listening to every word. Henry knew she was smart enough to keep quiet, but the foal was unpredictable. If it made a noise, if it gave them away, everything could change in an instant. The man studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp. "You sure you haven't seen a mare? Dark coat, about ready to drop a foal." Henry's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. "Like I said, don't know anything about that." The man's expression didn't change. He glanced toward the barn, as if weighing whether to push further. Then, after a moment, he let out a slow breath and stepped back. "All right," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe Henry. "If you do happen to see anything, you let me know." He turned, walking back toward his truck. Henry stayed rooted in place, his muscles tense as he watched the man climb inside. The engine revved, the truck hesitating for just a second longer. Then it pulled away, disappearing down the road. Henry didn't move until the taillights had completely vanished. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. Emily stepped out, her face pale. "Henry." "I know," he said quietly. She swallowed. He knew. Henry nodded. "And he'll be back." Inside the barn, the mare let out a faint breath, her eyes fluttering open for the first time in hours. The foal nudged at her, eager, hopeful. But Henry and Emily both knew that the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. The barn was silent, except for the soft sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls. Emily stood near the mare, her hand resting gently on the foal's back, feeling the warmth of its tiny body. The tension from the man's visit still hung thick in the air, but there was no time to dwell on fear. They had to act. Henry paced near the barn doors, running through their options. He knew one thing for sure. The man in the truck wasn't going to just disappear. He had seen the look in his eyes, the kind of cold calculation that told him this wasn't just about a missing horse. This was about money, power, and something far bigger than either of them had been prepared for. Emily finally spoke. "We can't stay here." Henry stopped, turning to her. "Where would we go?" She hesitated, looking down at the foal. "There's a sanctuary about 50 miles from here. I know the owner. If we can get her there, they won't be able to take her back." Henry considered it. It was risky. If the man had been watching them, he could follow. But staying put wasn't an option either. He exhaled, nodding. "All right, we move at first light." The rest of the night crawled by. Every sound outside made them flinch. Every passing set of headlights sent a wave of unease through them. Henry sat with his rifle close, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. Emily stayed with the mare, whispering to her, stroking her side, willing her to stay strong just a little longer. As dawn crept over the horizon, they got to work. The mare was still weak, but she managed to stand with their help, the foal sticking close to her side. Henry pulled his truck around, loading up the old horse trailer with extra hay and blankets. Every movement was quick and precise. They had no time to waste. Emily led the mare carefully, speaking to her in soft tones. The foal followed, its legs still wobbly but determined. Henry helped guide them into the trailer, securing the latch before climbing into the driver's seat. Emily slid in beside him, her hands gripping the edges of her jacket as she glanced out the window. They pulled onto the road, the morning still quiet. Henry kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that truck come barreling after them. But the road remained empty. An hour passed, then another. The tension in the truck slowly began to ease, but neither of them fully relaxed. Emily kept checking on the mare through the small window in the back, watching for any signs of distress. The foal stayed close, the two of them leaning into each other for support. Finally, they saw it, the wide, open fields of the sanctuary. Fences stretched for miles, dotted with horses of all shapes and sizes. The sight alone made Emily exhale in relief. As soon as Henry pulled through the gates, a woman in her 60s stepped out to greet them. Her name was Martha, and the moment she saw the mare, her expression softened. "You did the right thing bringing her here," she said, running a gentle hand over the horse's side. "She's been through hell, but she's a fighter." Emily smiled, her throat tight. "She has a baby now. She had to fight." Martha nodded, looking at the foal. "And now, she won't have to fight alone." They unloaded the mare carefully, leading her and the foal into a private pasture where they could rest. The sun was warm, the grass soft beneath their hooves. For the first time since that stormy night, the mare seemed at peace. Henry stood beside Emily, watching as the foal took hesitant steps forward, exploring its new surroundings. The weight of the past few days settled deep in his chest, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. Emily glanced at him. "Do you think they'll come looking?" Henry was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "Even if they do, they won't find her here." Martha smiled knowingly. "We've dealt with men like that before. They don't scare us." Henry believed her. This place, this sanctuary, was more than just a safe haven for animals. It was a place where second chances were given freely, where the past didn't define the future. Emily stepped closer to the fence, watching as the foal trotted toward its mother, nudging her playfully. A soft laugh escaped her, the first real one in days. Henry looked at her, then back at the horses. "What happens now?" Emily took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill her lungs. "Now they get to live." The mare turned her head toward them, her dark eyes filled with something Henry could only describe as gratitude. And as the foal let out a tiny, joyful sound, bouncing forward on unsteady legs, he knew, whatever had happened before, whatever darkness had tried to swallow them whole, it was over. The road that had nearly taken everything from this mare had led her to something better, to safety, to a future. And for Henry and Emily, it was a reminder that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, miracles really do happen.